This may be one of the best, if not the best, free online self-defense class for you. Randy King talks about deep into things that we don't talk about often. Why? You find out here. Buckle your seatbelt and enjoy the ride. So the big question is this. Why well-being conscious women just like us who want to live healthy and happy life are constantly feeling vulnerable, like, what if I get attacked? And so many people who teach self-defense are tough men or martial artists who don't seem to understand what women really go through every day. How can we feel safer and be more confident in our personal safety? That is the question, and this channel gives you the answer. My name is Kinko Hamilton, and welcome to Rise Up Against Violence. Okay, everyone, welcome to the show. And today, well, first of all, it's very rare that I find something I resonate so much and appreciate what they are teaching and sharing. And today's guest is somebody who I really become to respect and appreciate. All right, so without further ado, his name is Randy King, not Larry King, and he is the founder of KPC Self Defense since 2005. He teaches education-based self-defense in 8 different countries, bouncer, head of security, and a VIP protection for 15 years. And what's incredible about him is that he works with one of the most varied demographics, which include sex workers, martial athletes, law enforcement, youth at risk, white-collar workers, obviously blue-collar workers, and victims of trauma. I would like to welcome Randy so he can share his story and teach us something so important today. So Randy, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited, and thanks for following my stuff. So listeners, you don't get to hear the pre-interview thing, but she was like pulling up blogs of mine, and it was pretty cool. So I'm very excited to be on the show. Always, always good to be able to speak with more people and share the message and try to get as much good education out there as possible, especially in this industry.
Absolutely. So Randy, you had something. Well, you are obviously martial athlete, martial artist, and you've been practicing that, and you have some black belts as well. But something happened in 2002, and that changed the course of your, I would say, self-defense or perspective of your self-defense, correct?
Correct. Yeah. So in 2002, I was working at the bar that I worked at for a very long time. And already at this point, some of my black belt thought processes have been challenged, right? So, violence isn't consensual. People try and ambush you. Don't forget that, people stink. There's other things that people don't realize when it comes to self-defense because they practice it usually in a clean environment with partners they know. And that's not how non-consensual violence happens. It's BO and alcohol smell and just all these different possible things. So already at this point, I already had my cage a little rattled from my vision or belief on what self-defense was. And I really thought, because as I was a young male, I really thought it was like the movies, right? Like Bloodsport and like all those crazy Mortal Kombat type movies. Like, yeah, like this is violence, right? So, and then that got challenged fundamentally in 2002 when I was stabbed. So the story's kind of crazy, mostly because I didn't even realize there was a weapon in play until the doctor told me I'd been stabbed. So I was working at front door. I'll give you the Coles or the Cliff's Notes if you're in the US, Coles Notes here in Canada. I'm Canadian, a boot maple syrup. So the with the Cliff's Notes of it is I was working a door. A man came up to me, wanted to get in the bar. It was a Wednesday night. It was dead. Nobody was there. We had just implemented a no ID, no entry policy at this bar. It was kind of a rough and tumble kind of bar, and we were trying to clean it up a la Roadhouse. Not quite as cool. I didn't take down any mares, but it was very in that thought process of like, okay, let's clean this place up with, IDing everybody, having a dress code, yada, yada, yada. So guy walked in. I said no. Back at that point in time, I'd been bouncing for 2 years, and I kind of had a reputation. So I made the mistake of what we call assumed compliance, which was I said no. People learned that no meant no, but this guy didn't get the memo of how cool I was. And so he all of a sudden said, I'm going to challenge that. We got into a scuffle. I remember it punched me multiple times. That's where I first experienced the freeze. And that's one of the biggest pieces of work that I do, is talking about freezes in overwhelming situations. So I experienced a freeze. I threw the guy out the door. I was easily twice the size of him. So I am a former martial athlete. Like, I used to be in shape once upon a time. I'm not anymore. But once upon a time, I was in shape and competing. I whipped this guy against a truck. His arm went down, then over top, looked like he was throwing a standard haymaker you learn in every self-defense course. Threw it up. I wrapped his arm, started hitting him. He tried to pepper me with punches from my head to my leg. Finally got me in the leg, whatever. I threw him down. He grabbed me. He grabbed my shirt. I threw him at the ground. Then another doorman came out, bouncer. We call him doorman here in Canada, but bouncer. Another bouncer came out, and the guy ran off. And my left ear was almost ripped directly off of my head. So I decided to go to the doctor because it was only holding on by 2 pieces of skin. Like, he held it as I threw him at the ground. So as I went to the doctor, I walked in, I was limping, and the bar was a very rough bar. And so I was at the hospital more often than not during or after shift. And the nurse that I recognize, who I see all the time, she asked me why I was walking, AKA like a gangster, because I was limping. And I'm like, I'm not walking like a gangster. What are you talking about? And then she said, I don't know, whatever, you look weird. And then she asked me about a cut that was on my leg. And I didn't think anything of it. I was there for my ear. So I sat down, took a deep breath, and it's like somebody spilled a hot cup of coffee on my leg. All of a sudden, it started hurting really bad, and there was blood. So went back, found out there was a knife wound 1 inch in, 3 inches across my leg. So we went back to the tape, because luckily I'm one of the few instructors I know of that I don't have it, but I had both the knife video, like my anecdotal experience, but also the CCTV. So the closed caption TV the closed circuit TV showed that first punch I talked about. He actually pulled a knife out of his pocket, was trying to stab me in the neck. I luckily got my hands up, wrapped around. Zero training, just not zero training in that. I've never practiced startle flinch at that point. Or none of that. So wrapped my arm. The peppering of punches, him trying to stab me all the way down my body. He didn't get me, luckily, until he got into my leg. It went into my leg, and then when I threw him, that disarmed him. He let go of the knife when he hit the ground. Hit a wall, then he came back at the ground, but that disarmed him. So I literally only survived the encounter because of luck and some standing wrestling training. And so that was kind of where my entire focus switched from physical first self-defense to education first self-defense. Because when we looked at the tape, if you Monday morning quarterbacked, if you went back over it with the information, like knowing what was going to happen, you could see him checking for his knife. You could see him checking distance. You could see him looking around. But I was so busy doing the second most important part of security's job, which was flirting with a waitress. I wasn't paying attention at all to this guy. I was talking to a woman. So there was so many things that I could have avoided this situation, but because it wasn't addressed, it wasn't talked about, we never even thought to ask the questions about this kind of stuff. I was sold a pack of lies. I was sold, if you can compete and win a gold medal, that makes you Batman, that makes you invincible. And that's fundamentally untrue. And so that pivoted me. So for a year, I stopped. For 1 whole year, I didn't train at all. I was done. I was like, what's the point of even doing this? I was in a depressed state. Then I came across a book by, hopefully somebody you know, and I'm sure everybody, your listeners heard of it, Rory Miller. And I read a book called Meditation on Violence. And I became very lucky to become one of Rory's proteges. We're doing a tour in September all across the US, co-headlining. But that was my first touch point on, oh my God, people are talking about this. Just, it's not the common talk. And it's becoming more and more common now. But this was 2002, right? I was still believing my instructors about chi healing and stuff like that I didn't, like, they did, whether they did it right or wrong, I couldn't fact check anything because I didn't have the internet as a resource to do that, right? So it was interesting, but that's kind of what got me to what I do now.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story, Randy. How's your leg, by the way, and your ear?
So it's totally fine. It was like, oh, I guess that's like almost 10 years ago. Jesus.
Yeah.
I kind of wish, this is kind of funny. I wish the scar was more badass because you can barely see it. It's like I have a surgery scar, which looks way cooler. And so when I'm like being like, yeah, I got stabbed, they're like, show me. And it's like the tiniest little discoloration on my leg. But no, I came back full mobility. I've had worse injuries, so it wasn't the end of the world, obviously, but it definitely, watching the video, I could have easily ended any one of those other shots, could have landed somewhere. So I came across very lucky.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say because of that, you became an actual, not martial artist, but self-defense instructor coach, which was kind of, I hate to say put this word, but it was kind of like a blessing, right?
Yeah. 100% it was, especially looking through my career of, like you mentioned, that I have such a big demographic of people that I work with. Like, thank God that guy almost tried to kill me because now I get to help hundreds and thousands of other people not be in the same situation. So the goal we have here is the lessons that I had to pay for in blood, we can hopefully, you can learn the same lesson without the same price, right? So
Absolutely. And then, Randy, you mentioned that you now focus on education-based self-defense.
yeah.
Could you elaborate on that, please? I don't know if we are on the same page.
Sure. So to me, education self-defense is giving people, well, I guess let's start right at the core of self-defense. So for me, self-defense is about you, the client, not me, the instructor. So right off the bat, that's where my biggest separation is from martial arts to self-defense. Now, I am not saying martial arts is bad. It's super awesome. I box, I wrestle, I do jujitsu. It's great stuff. Don't get me wrong. But when you think self-defense is trying not to get yourself in a bad situation, not signing up for one, right? Trying to understand what I'm capable of doing in the moment I need to do it. So even you at the gym might not be you in the self-defense situation. Maybe you had a couple glasses of wine, maybe you're tired, maybe, right? Maybe you rolled your ankle. So to me, self-defense is number one about you in the moment you're in the encounter. Now, educational based self-defense, very simply, to me, in my opinion, is giving people the tools to the pre-contact cues or the stuff before it happens. That's where the education is. And then the physical part, while not unimportant, should be a last resort in certain situations, assuming you weren't ambushed. So the kind of theory I work with is 80% of the material you're going to get from me is going to be understanding violence trends, victim profiles, what kind of markers you have, what potential crimes you could be victimized by. Because let's say me and Kinko are in the same room. I'm not going to be like, all right, so here's what you're going to do. Become a 6'1", 220-pound man, and then do these ninja. Like it's not helpful. Who cares what your coach can do if you can't do it? So the education to me seems to work better because education is accessible now and technique takes time. So if I have you for a compressed time window, let's say I have you for 6 hours, we're probably only going to do 2 hours of physical training. The other 4 hours is going to be threat assessment, indications, learning how to manage your own adrenaline, like those kind of situations. So for me, education has to come first because in a panic, physical skills fall apart exceptionally quickly, but one repetition in a basic skill set will help you. So statistically speaking, let's use an example here. When you're on an airplane, when we're allowed to travel on airplanes back in the day, they do the safety dance, which is like the exits are here, this is the right. So everybody hates that because it's so boring and pointless, but statistically it's been shown multiple times that even one repetition of visualizing where an exit is will help you perform better under stress. They don't make you stand up and walk to the door. They just tell you where the door is. That's the same kind of thought process I have, which is education will beat technique because technique falls apart and education accessible almost immediately.
Right on, Randy. You said it right. Absolutely. 100% agree. I would like to refer back to you talk about freeze. You froze. And that's something, major point that you teach your students. Could you tell us about that? Because, freeze, exactly. Freeze, flinch, and those things. Those are the things like totally missing from the today's self-defense industry. And not many people teaching about it, which they should be teaching about the first, as one of the first things to how they deal with it, right?
Right.
So what's your, we all panic in a stressful situation.
Yep.
How can we get out, or AKA freeze? How can we get out of frozen situation?
Sure. So I teach freeze a lot different than a lot of other instructors. I went really deep into it because the freeze portion of my encounter was where my shame was directly attached to in my underperformance. And I find this seems to be consistent with people who experience violent crime, violent sexual assault, muggings, is that the shame attaches to the inaction portion, not the action portion, right? So the reason I went down such a deep rabbit hole on it was, number one, nobody told me about freezing other than, like, scare them in the ring so they don't move for a moment, and then you can do this, this, and this. So there is a portion of that. So the model that I use for the freeze has 3 different areas. And I want to stay right off the top of this. You cannot in my experience, you cannot fix a freeze during the freeze. You have to train before it to make sure it is shortened. So I'm going to talk about depth and duration a little bit. There's 3 levels of freeze I talk about, and then like 1 variant. So the first one is called the detection freeze. A detection freeze we've all experienced. So if your kid scared you, or your brother or uncle or whatever, and you just go, and then you keep going, that's your detection freeze. Very quick, very short, very common. That's what, if you're sparring, that's what you're trying to take advantage of when you're trying to get points, that detection freeze. Next is what's called the shocked freeze. This is the one that gets the most explanation in the self-defense world because, and I'll explain why in a second, but the shocked freeze very simply is something happens in a way you didn't expect it to happen. So my example is creepy massage guy from work who's giving massages unconsensually. He's always been a creeper. You kind of just let it go. And then at the Christmas party, he gets a little drunk and makes a more aggressive move. And then you freeze because you're shocked. This is behavior while you kind of expect, you didn't think it was going to happen. This happened to me the first time I was punched in the face with rings. I froze because I'd only been punched with gloves. And so my brain was like, oh, we know what a punch is like. Then when I got punched with rings, my brain was like, wait a minute, we don't know what a punch is like. So it took me a second. That usually takes about 7 seconds. Some instructors say you can break that freeze. I see no evidence pointing to that. I think it just stops. If we use logic here, if you're frozen, you're doing nothing. So when somebody asks me, what do I do when my brain is making me do nothing? Well, if you're doing nothing, there's nothing you can do. So there's no tip or trick I can tell you other than you have to train beforehand. Then the one that's the least talked about, and the one that, and it's not talked about because of malice, and it's not talked about because people are trying to hide it. It's just that most of the people that wrote the self-defense books that we reference are very highly trained people. Very highly trained people get most of the situations they're going to face that gets dealt with in their training. So they're never going to go past a shocked freeze because they kind of know everything that's going to happen. And if something happens weirdly, it's easier to get a hold of. An overwhelmed freeze is something happens that you did not believe could happen to you, or you have no good options to get out of it. So we have to remember the brain is the only organ that gets to be selfish, right? So the brain wants to live, and it will sacrifice as much of your body as it can to let itself survive. So the natural reaction of your brain in an overwhelmed freeze, so again, something happened you had no idea could possibly happen, or you have 0 options, you are restrained, you're tied down, your brain goes to a place of like, okay, we need to survive. So let whatever happens, we'll get through this. Now, why, again, this isn't talked about is experienced guys won't experience this because their experience already got rid of it. When we talk civilian self-defense, and that's where I specialize in, is civilian-based, a lot of civilians haven't been punched in the face. A lot of civilians haven't been tied down and sexually assaulted. A lot of civilians haven't, et cetera, et cetera. And they haven't even visualized it. They haven't even put any reps in this because they think it's outside of what could happen to them. When that happens, the brain shuts down and shuts down hard. And that freeze could last all the way through the entire encounter. I have a story. It's a little bit off color about a sex worker that experiences freeze. Is that okay if I tell it?
Absolutely, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
So one of my former clients, she is no longer a sex worker. And just heads up, here in Canada, sex work is legal. So yeah, so that's why I work with them, because it's a legal profession here. So Kimco didn't know that. That was a shocking face. So yeah, so it's legal up here. Which is why I have the access to them that I have access, because I don't know how else I would have met them. So,
Well, I thought you were going like undercover, like a.
I wish it was that cool. No, they started signing up because of my guilt-free approach to self-defense. I don't tell you what you should have done. I don't armchair quarterback you, right? So anyways, she was working in one of the massage parlors here in Canada. A man came in, and she was a submissive. And if you don't know, if you're listening to know what that is, that just means that the submissive like takes pain a little bit, but they're the one that's supposed to be in control. The dominant gets to do kind of what they want. But again, it's all based off the submissive's permission. So as per normal, she was tied up. That was part of the call she was doing. But the client broke the rules by tearing his condom off and then having sex with her. So this is the hardest conversation part of me for this is she got raped at that point. The second the deal was broken, the fact that he wasn't wearing a condom, because that's legally required, you have to be safe here. The fact he ripped up the condom means that is now a rape. That's no longer consent. Doesn't matter if money was changed, the deal was broken and something happened. So she was tied down, face down on the table, hands across, so only her butt was facing him, her stomach was down. I don't care who you are. I don't care if you're the toughest person on the planet. There is no good option for being tied down in a submissive position. There's nothing she could have done. So she went into a freeze, and this is again where she attached her shame to. She went into a freeze. Her brain kind of went somewhere else. The man did what he was going to do. He then untied her. Now, the two things I want to talk when we talk about freeze is habit and ritual, and depth and duration. So I want you to understand that the only thing that comes out under highly stressful situations is habit or ritual, something you've done over and over and over again in the area that's experienced. So that's why, for example, kids that played sports do better at martial arts, because kids that play sports have learned how to move, duck, pivot, etc. It's not because they're natural martial artists. Their brain has a pattern to deal with that kind of stimulus. It's not exactly the same, but an athlete crossing over will almost always do better than somebody who doesn't cross over. So habit and ritual. If you're a basketball player and a car comes at you, the odds of you jumping out of the way are much higher than a person who's not used to something coming at them, because of how your brain works with reward signals. Her habit and ritual, because she was so stressed out after you untied her because of, does she now have a sexually transmitted disease? Is she pregnant now? What is going on? She went into a habit, which was thanking the client for coming and then walking him out of the building. So the reason you have to remember this is when you're in a hardcore freeze, you go into autopilot. You're going to just do whatever habit or ritual comes in. And that's why so many instructors talk about training, and scenario training in different situations, because the more situation you have touch points on, the better you're going to do. This has never happened to her before. So she thanked them, walked them out of the building. She called the police. Unfortunately, the police didn't understand the overwhelmed freeze. Luckily, I knew some of the officers, so we explained it. So it looked like to them, she was okay with the whole situation, because after it happened, she thanked him and she walked him out of the building, and she was trying to say, like, I was raped. Like, well, it doesn't look like that because of this. Luckily, because again, it's legal here, they're considered vulnerable citizens. So they listen to them more than the other person. And also because she was training with me, we could explain to the officer, I'm like, okay, this is how freezes work. I could reference, there's a paper in Psychology Today. The author of it is the one that created this model that I'm using. I got to talk to him. I showed them that article. They luckily pressed charges. So freezing is interesting because it's going to be different for everybody. If you come from a violent background and you're used to seeing violence, your freeze is going to be less intense. So training and conditioning shortens the depth and duration of freeze. So if you have enough training, you'll never hit that overwhelmed freeze. But vice versa, trauma increases the depth and duration of the freeze. So if you have traumatic experiences, somebody might scare you and you won't just go, you might go to an overwhelmed freeze, fall into a ball and start crying, because trauma does the opposite of training. So when it comes to this, sorry, it's a very long talk. There's 3 levels: detection, shocked, overwhelmed. Overwhelmed is not very common, but the second you explain the overwhelmed freeze to almost any sexual assault survivor, they're like, oh my God, that's what happened to me. And it becomes powerful because once you know that what you did was a normal response, you can let some of that shame go. You can stop being like, oh, I underperformed. And I can be like, no, your brain just never experienced that before. Of course you didn't do well. You didn't have a plan. Humans suck without plans. And that's the proponent for the physical training after that.
Randy,
Yes.
thank you so much for explaining that to us. I mean, seriously, this is so deep and it's so good. And it's been incredible, Randy. Like, I don't know what to say. And I know our interview time is like approaching to the end,
Sure.
but I really don't want to let you go right now. And I want to ask you one more thing.
That's fine.
if it's okay.
Yep.
I was earlier mentioning this blog that really got me to dig deep in Randy King, and I'm glad that I did it. And Randy said on this blog, oh, by the way, I'm going to put the link below here so you can read it too. You mentioned about the element of surprise. So Randy mentioned element of surprise, how important it is to use element of surprise, right? And yes, of course, bad guy wants to use element of surprise you, so you are unaware of that bad guy, and he has a better chance of doing whatever he wants to do. Yep. You can use that to your advantage, right? Could you share about the element of surprise, how you can use that, and also referring back to the victim that you mentioned, the sex worker, that she was completely overwhelmed by element of surprise, right?
Yep.
And there was nothing you could do about it. So that's the devastating effect of element of surprise when it's used against you. But Brandy, could you share with us how we can use element of surprise as our advantage?
Yes, absolutely. So element of surprise is so crucial when it comes to any kind of attack encounter situation. I think one of the biggest quotes that I'm known for is, if you're not taking damage and not being transported, you could try to make your situation better. And that's where the element of surprise comes in, right? Is humans do badly without a plan. Humans do badly with compressed time to make a decision, right? And that's where the beauty of an ambush is so perfect against us. And that's why even today, like with our military technology being as crazy as it is, drone strikes are still one of the most dangerous things because you can't see the drone dropping the bomb, so you can't prepare. We usually don't talk about this from the aggressor side, right? So they might jump you, pay attention, situational awareness, all that really important stuff you need to know. We can flip it though. A lot of people, especially if you go technique first training, which is like, if they do this, I do this. They're just waiting for their chance to use their skills as opposed to assessing the situation to maybe make it better, right? I need you to understand that human beings are not on top of the food chain because we are the biggest and strongest and fastest. It's because we lie and we have thumbs and we work in groups, right? So this equates to violence a lot more than the honorable type samurai bushido type of code is. Humans hunted packs, we use weapons, we're going to try to ambush to win. You would never fight a tiger by squaring up against the tiger and try to punch it unconscious. It's a bigger, stronger animal. You'd hide, you'd get weapons, you'd ambush it, you'd wait till it's sleeping. You need to treat the predator like that as well, because they're usually bigger, stronger, more aggressive, have chemicals in their system. There's some reason they chose you to victimize you. Whether they're right or wrong doesn't matter. They chose you for a specific purpose. And it could be just because you have the same haircut their grade 3 teacher had and you did nothing wrong, right? So I really want you to understand, if you're a victim of violence, you can make no mistakes and still be affected by violence. You could have perfect situational awareness. You could be in tip-top shape. And then you just have your eyebrow piercing or mind's crazy McGee of a girlfriend that he once hit and he loses his mind. And you made zero mistakes, which is why I don't care. I'm not a big proponent of like what you wear, how your hair is. That doesn't really matter to me. But when we're in these situations, we have to look at the whole situation, the context of it, not just the moment in time of the physical encounter. So somebody approaches you on the street. Yes, you could get in your defensive position, and you should, but you should also be looking for exits, witnesses, weapons of opportunity or improvised weapons. You should be getting to a better position. You can also lie to strangers. And I think this is one of the hardest things for people to do, because the people that take these courses are generally good people. So they don't want to be liars. They don't want to do whatever. But guess what? If you're never going to see them again, who cares? You could be walking out of your house with a balloon that says, I love my home. And if somebody says, do you live here? You can say, no. Right. And then, so that alone, that will give them, that'll take them off. So that's that kind of mental aspect of it. For the physical aspect of it, you want to get them, if you can, again, if you're not getting hurt and you're not being transported. If you're being transported, you have to fight like crazy because secondary crime locations are super dangerous. And if you're being hurt, don't try to de-escalate. You're being punched, you do something else. But there's almost always a lead up, especially we talk about the asocial predatory type violence. There's some kind of lead up to it. If you can use that time to make your situation better, that's always going to help. So you don't want to be the biggest, strongest monkey in the zoo. You want to be the trickiest chimp there. You want to make sure nobody messes with you. You want to be smarter than these big, aggressive people. Fighting fire with fire in this situation isn't great. There's another story I have of a real estate agent that worked in Toronto, Canada. She was taken into a home. She was grabbed by both her wrists. She was pushed over a sink, so she had no center of balance. Everything your coach tells you not to do, she was in a position of, and the guy informed her he was going to rape her. She obviously freaked out, but she knew she had nothing she could do. The guy outweighed her by like 100 pounds. He had both her wrists, and he put her head over her heels, which is every takedown on the planet, overarching a sink like this. Just like the story before, there is no martial arts answer there. I don't care if you're Hoist Gracie, there's just no way you're going to beat that situation because of the ambush or the initiative of the attacker. The woman, very intelligent, very cool under pressure, she said, wouldn't this be more comfortable in the bedroom? The man said, it would. And then because she looked like she was complying, he released the grip. He thought she was going to play along. The second he released her grip and she stood up, she smashed his head into the wall, then smashed his head into the bathtub and got the hell out of the building. That's what I'm talking about when I'm saying you want to take the initiative back. Just because you start on your heels doesn't mean you have to stay there. You can talk, you can lie, you can de-escalate, you can buy time, you can compliment them to make them check their hair. So one of their hands is up, you can pop them in the throat. There's so many other things than just the silent type of physical training that we do. I want you to use your whole brain to deal with these situations. And this kind of thinking is why we can make self-defense available to smaller humans, elderly humans, because if we just do fire on fire, my daughter can never defend herself. She just can't because she won't have the technical, I'm like, all right, increase your deadlift should not be your self-defense advice, right? But if I teach her to, these are weapons, these are exits, this is what you can say, this is where you can hit, this is how you can buy time, using your entire brain to solve the situation is always going to be better as a human being than just trying to fight fire with fire. That being said, sometimes you have to fight fire with fire. But a lot of the time, again, if we go back to my stabbing story at the beginning, if I would have saw him looking cracky, twitching, doing witness checks, checking his weapon every 3 seconds, I would have dealt with that a lot differently, and maybe I wouldn't have my I got stabbed story, right? So people are always giving us information by what they choose to wear, by how they act, by what their hands and eyes are doing. If you can use that to your advantage and you can retake the initiative or gain the ambush on them, your odds of surviving are much, much higher.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, Randy, it's been fantastic. And wow, such I hate to say this word, but like has been a wonderful free self-defense class. And I love to thank you. I love to thank you for that.
No problem.
All right, so Randy, is there a last word or words of wisdom you'd like to share with the audience?
I don't know if there is. I think the thing I want you to take away from this is self-defense is about you, not about your system or coach. So if you need to be able to do what you do in that situation, the way I train my 12-year-old daughter is not the way I train my powerlifting bouncer buddies, right? So it doesn't matter what the certificates on the wall say. It doesn't matter where they've gone or what they've done or how cool they are, what their resume says. If they can't get you to replicate self-defense in a way you can do it, then there's no need for you to be there. And I think that's one of the biggest things. And obviously, other than that, education over fight would be great. If you can prevent a problem, it's always better than dealing with a problem. So just looking at that kind of stuff. There's a ton of resources out there. Not just me. Like you can go all over Instagram. There's hundreds of thousands of people talking about this. And grab as much info as you can.
Randy King, it's been a pleasure having you, and thank you so much for being on the show.
I appreciate your time. Thank you so much, and thanks everyone for listening.
Would you like to get the devices from the world's top self-defense experts? If so, go on and get your pass from www.womensselfdefensesummit.com.